Thank you all for joining us this evening. And I would like to thank the organizers of this particular day, Dr. Raghda Al-Ibrashi and Professor Ralph Klishevsky, and with the support of Dr. Hagar Adib and Dr. Hadir Hamad. And yeah, without further ado, I think if you have joined us yesterday, you'll find also the panels today also enriching and providing a different perspective on sustainability, which is the theme of the cross-cutting theme across management, innovation, design, and so on. And therefore, you will find today also quite insightful, hopefully. And without further ado, I would leave the floor to Dr. Raghda Al-Ibrashi, who's going to moderate the session today. Yeah. Dr. Raghda, you want to take over?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Noor. So good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to the second day of Minds and to thank you all for participating, presenting, and listening from different areas of the world. So as Professor Noor said, today we'll be focusing on managerial and sustainable practices in multinational organizations in different countries, focusing on emerging countries and sustainable economic impacts of such strategies. What's really interesting about today is that we bridge the academic and industry divide by having presenters who have well-established academic background presenting their seminal academic articles and other presenters who have strong practical experience presenting applied papers and research. So our aim today is to bring academia and industry together to provide better and concrete understanding of sustainability theories and practices of multinational emerging countries, as well as discuss new financial instruments and economic strategies promoting sustainability in emerging economies. So my name is Raghda Al-Ibrashi, Associate Professor of Strategic Management and Head of the Management and Organization Department at the German University in Cairo. And I'll be moderating the sessions of today. And excuse me if I'll be bombarding some presenters with some questions to stimulate the discussion. Dr. Hagar Adib and Dr. Hadir Hamad are here for any logistical issues and admitting participants. Thanks very much for their efforts for yesterday and today, of course. Some minor logistical issues, as Professor Noha also noted yesterday. So I will keep time for presenters, so try to stick to your time. Any of the participants, if you'd like to ask any questions, that's very much welcomed, and we encourage, of course, to stimulate discussion. But please do that after presentations. To do that, please raise your hands through Zoom or write in the chat. And lastly, as you all do here, please always mute yourself if you're not asking questions or presenting. Thank you very much, everyone. And now it's time to start our first session, multinational approaches to sustainability. We have two esteemed presenters, Professor Dr. Howard Florian Becker, MNC's Corporate Environmental Responsibility in Emerging and Developing Economies toward an Action Research Approach. Professor Florian is Professor of Economic and Organizational Sociology, University of Applied Sciences, Berlin. And the second presentation is by Professor Dr. Julia Schwarzkopf, and she'll be presenting the role of MNCs in sustainable supply chain management and implications for suppliers. Professor Julia is professor at the University of Applied Sciences, Berlin as well. Before starting the presentation, what is interesting or what is intersecting between the two presentations that Professor Florian will be talking about the negative externalities of multinational corporations in developing countries and how to mitigate such externalities. Dr. Julia will provide us with a definition for sustainable supply chains of that can be applied by multinational companies, and we'll be talking about practical examples applied by multinational companies and the advantages of applying those throughout the supply chain. So we'll start with Professor Florian and we'll take it from there.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Because time is and we have so much to share, I can introduce myself. So I worked at the GUC. Some might remember that between 2011 and 14, specializing at that time as a chair for international business. Now I have moved on to work at the HTW in Berlin, as many of you might be aware, and I'm focusing really on organization studies with a strong reference to the behavior of multinational enterprises. Now, I would like to present a paper today that is titled MNC's Corporate Environmental Responsibility in Emerging Markets and Developing Countries Towards an Action Research Approach. And I should add that I rather focus on the first part and not so much on the second, because we don't have so much time. But the basic idea of the paper, which this presentation is based on, that we want to develop together with industry solutions how multinationals could behave more responsibly in emerging markets. The paper is authored or co-authored by my colleagues Katharina Simbeck and my dear colleague Raghda El-Barashi in Cairo. And I am also proud to mention here that we received a commended paper award from Emerald for this paper. So yeah, that's quite a nice thing. And I hope we can take this further, this topic, into some real empirical work. All right, what is the agenda of this paper? Again, you know, I guess I have a bit too many slides, but still I think that should be enough time to convey the main message. So with this paper, we wanted to move beyond the pollution haven perspective, which basically argues that multinational enterprises often go to developing countries in order to pollute those environments. And while this is certainly the case, and there are some firms who very deliberately do that, I realized during my time in India, and I stayed a prolonged time in New Delhi, and then I lived for 3 years in Egypt, I realized that a lot of problems with regard to environmental pollution, they are not necessarily triggered by deliberately nasty business behavior, but more by negative side effects of quite normal business behavior. So just a simple example, I remember when I was living in Cairo, I would love to shop at Carrefour. Now, like in Europe, many of the products that Carrefour sells are wrapped in plastic. And so many of these plastic wrappings, they end up somewhere in the environment and they are not recycled properly. So I thought there is something that I would call exacerbated negative externalities of business behavior. So there are, you could argue, some negative effects in those countries that are stronger than, for instance, in Europe or in Germany for that matter. So if a supermarket chain in Germany also produces negative effects, but many of these negative effects are basically buffered by, let's say, institutions that have a buffering effect and that control these negative externalities. And I will explain this a bit more in a moment. And one of the main explanations that I had for this, the fact that you experience more negative externalities in emerging markets, is to say, well, part of the problem is probably that institutions don't work as they work, let's say, in other more developed economies. So we transpose the term of institutional voids to the context of environmental pollution in emerging markets. So the concept of voids comes more from transaction cost theory and refers to more also emerging markets, but more to how buyers and suppliers, how they would not necessarily find to one another in emerging markets. We give this definition a somewhat different meaning. But we didn't want to leave it there. We didn't just want to point to the problem, but we wanted to say, okay, if institutions in emerging markets, well, if they are not functioning as much as they should or could to buffer these negative externalities, then we call on multinational enterprises to actually buffer or to take responsibility to make sure that these negative externalities don't come up in the first place. And this is what we call here different CER strategies for multinationals. All right, so this is the story of the paper in a nutshell. Now let me move on to some basic definitions here, because I think we should have a common ground what we're talking about. So when we talk of corporate environmental responsibility, we refer to corporate behavior or practices that benefit the environment or mitigate the adverse impact of business on the environment. And these are, of course, behaviors that go beyond those that our companies are legally obliged to carry out. So this is our understanding here in this paper of corporate environmental responsibility. Now you might ask, why should multinational enterprise focus more on corporate environmental responsibility, particularly in developing countries? And I've given that already partly away in the first statements I made, because we basically say, well, many of their normal products and business models that they transfer have more severe effects on the environment as they would have, let's say, in more developed contexts. So just some images here, people who have lived in Delhi or Beijing, who have worked there would realize that the environmental pollution is really crazy there. We all see here these elephants on the garbage heap. So these are things that we often see in emerging markets. This is not to say we're not developed countries are not polluting. It's just to say that oftentimes the polluting effects are particularly grave in emerging market and developing countries. And they're not only affected, but they're also in many ways major polluters. So if we look at water pollution, for instance, or the plastic pollution, then we find, for instance, that a lot of emerging markets are also quite serious players here, including Egypt, for instance. Okay, but this is not a blame game. It's basically to say, well, in these countries, we have severe effect of environmental pollution. Now we want to adopt the normative perspective here, because this was published also in a critical journal. And we are asking here is why or what questions multinationals should ask when they operate in emerging markets. So we should ask, or they should ask, why are environmental problems in emerging markets and developing countries often graver? We call this exacerbated. They should ask what they can do about these negative externalities that they cause. And of course, in the end, also, where does environmental responsibility of multinational enterprises, where does it start, but also where does it end? Because of course, you cannot oblige multinationals to save the whole country and the whole world. So this is the question that we want to address towards the end. Now, what is the problem with exacerbated negative externalities? So you here see a bottle of Coke, and you see here the negative externality of using a bottle of Coke. So there's a consumer that drinks the Coke. That's the first transaction party. Then there's the seller of that Coke. That's another part of the transaction. But there's a negative externality because someone will suffer from this Coke bottle ending up maybe in a fish net, or maybe in the stomach of a fish. So some third party will be negatively affected by this economic transaction. So we could argue business activities, any business activities, probably they create negative externalities. But in emerging markets and developing countries, because they lack certain institutions that mitigate these negative externalities, for that reason, there are particularly strong effects. And this is related to what we call here institutional voids of environmental protection. So there are negative externalities. These negative externalities are exacerbated. Why? Because there are institutional voids. Very briefly, for those who are not so familiar with the concept of negative externalities, what are negative externalities? Negative externalities are usually the effects of third parties of economic transactions. So what could be those effects? I will be a bit quick here because I'm just keeping a watch on the time. Of course, air, water, land pollution from factories, similar pollution from agriculture, from construction and traffic. So if you step into your car and if you ride your car from, let's say, Mahdi to the GOC, you pollute the environment and you affect someone that is not directly involved or benefiting from that transaction. All right, so what are now institutional voids that usually buffer these negative externalities? So I know this is a very table with very small font, let's say, or size of the letters. So, but what I'm trying to say here is that there are a range of institutions in usually developed countries that do buffer these negative externalities. So what we have here, and I will not go through the whole table, but you find in some developed countries that environmental protection is stipulated in the constitution. You will find a highly developed legislation of environmental protection. You will find agencies that monitor environmental protection. And you find also more informal institutions where, let's say, kids are socialized from rather early on to respect the environment. So if I compare, for instance, my kids with myself, I can see that they have different social norms with respect to separating garbage, for instance, which I still tend to ignore. So anyways, what you basically have here is there's a huge spectrum of institutions in many developed countries that somehow buffer one way or another let's say a good example is here water treatment plants or what have you. So these are institutions that usually test and monitor and in a number of ways buffer these negative effects of business behavior. Garbage collection would be one of them, a functioning garbage recycling system. Okay, so that's, again, because of we're short of time, I will be really quick here, but these are institutions that normally help to buffer these negative effects. Now, in emerging markets and developing countries, these are often weak or incoherent, and sometimes, or most of the time, actually, they're quite good legislation, but there's an implementation gap. So there are no monitoring agencies that really reliably monitor that these legislations are being looked after. So or implemented. So that's what we call implementation gap. And there's a brief side here, and there have another side, and for time reasons, I just skipped that. But basically the gist of this, the message here is that there are oftentimes, there is legislation, but the implementation of those standards, though these institutions, they don't work as they should to buffer these negative effects. Okay, I think we've made that clear. Now, what can multinational enterprises do to deal with these problems? We call this here corporate environmental responsibility strategies. And we have here 4 strategies that firms can actually apply to cope with this. The first thing is just to ignore and deny. Another one is to circumvent the institutional void. Yet another one is coping with the institutional void. And the last one is compensating the institutional void. And I will give some quick examples and for these different types of behaviors. First of all, I think ignoring and denying is not an option anymore for many multinationals. Why not? Because I think stakeholder pressure, fear of reputational damage, also opportunities to save costs, and also obligations in the home environment. Julia can probably say more about this, but there is a so-called supply chain legislation now in Germany. So if you pollute in the abroad, you are subject to punishment back home. So there are a number of reasons why you cannot deny anymore and just ignore those problems that your business system or your products might cause. Now, here's a systematic account how firms can deal with these problems. And the first question that you have to ask, if you transfer a business model or product, does it, and there's no institution in the guest country, does it matter? So if you export bananas, for instance, and the peel ends up somewhere in the environment, it may not matter. But on the other hand, let's say transfer plastic wrappings, then might very well matter. So what can you do if these institutions do matter? And here we suggest in the paper, you can either circumvent, so you don't introduce the product in the first place, or you withdraw the product from the market, or you adapt the product or the business model in such a way that it doesn't cause negative externalities, or you borrow from foreign institutions that help you to cover the institutional void that is that is a problem in the guest country. The other option is, if you can't circumvent, is to actually cope with the void. So you can internalize the problem through internal substitutions, for instance, or you can fill the institutional void. And the last option is, if you cannot fill the void, if you cannot circumvent, you might at least be able to compensate for it. So you pollute, but you do something that compensates for your pollution. So these are the different options that firms have. And I see that just have hardly a minute left. But one example of circumventing is, for instance, Carrefour's introduction of biodegradable plastic bags. So if you just throw them somewhere in the environment, even if there's no proper garbage collection, then they will degrade and in the ideal case at least, and not pollute. Or this is an example from an Italian firm that didn't find environmental certification in India, and then borrowed from Germany this institution, and basically used that institution to, because there was a void, to introduce these managerial environmental standards. Internalizing is also an interesting option of coping. So Philips or Unilever on the Philippines, not Philips, Unilever, they, for instance, built a factory inside their plant for water treatment. So that way, because there was no water treatment available in the country, or at least not in that region, they kind of, internalized the problem, and, that way they cope with the void. Another nice example is here Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola, for instance, in Mexico, they joined hands through an NGO with other multinational corporations and local firms, and they built they built institutions through education of children, but more importantly through building up recycling plants. So that's external filling of those gaps. The last actions that I wanted to mention here is compensating for the things you do. So Coke has promised, it will be interesting to see whether they really live up to it, but for every bottle they produce, they will collect a bottle by the year 2030. So they want to have a zero impact on the environment. So they, even if some of their bottles end up in the environment, they will collect others to compensate for that. Mercedes in India built 50,000 trees to compensate for the CO2 emissions that their plant causes. Whether this is a real compensation can be debated, but nevertheless, you know, it's a starting point. But then there's also what I call symbolic compensation, when Mercedes or when Coca-Cola in India does beach cleanups every year, once a year. That obviously is nowhere near compensating for the pollution they do through having their bottles ending up in the environment. So that's what we call in this paper symbolic compensation. All right, I'm rushing here a bit through the paper, but I just have two more slides left, and I think I'm almost there. So 15 minutes. I know, a bit quick here, but so what we argue, where does the, or what we ask here finally, where does the environmental responsibility start? Where does it end? And we believe that compliance with environmental laws and regulations is certainly not enough, because it does not suffice to prevent the negative externalities in developing countries. So just sticking to the legislation is simply no way out, because the negative externalities, because of institutional voids, are too grave. So what we ask multinationals to do is to do a thorough assessment of the negative environmental externalities that their products and business models cause, to adopt strategies, and we suggest 4 here to implement strategies that prevent and neutralize these negative externalities. And of course, act as a role model for other firms. We saw in the case of Coke in Mexico, where they joined hands with local firms to fill institutional voids. And that way, because they're also resourceful, they're powerful and very educated, these firms, in very many ways, they should, that's our claim here, they should act as role models, and they can play a very important role in filling the institutional voids of environmental protection in emerging markets. All right, so that's my literature. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry that I rushed this a little bit, but I hope that the main message went across.
Thank you very much, Professor Florian. And before we go to Professor Julia, derived from the last slide that you presented, or the last 2 slides that you presented, talking about the concept of institutional voids. As you may know, the concept emerged in the international business literature as like multinationals try to work on solving institutional voids in emerging countries in order to reach these markets. And there are various papers talking about that, talking about strategies to solve or to overcome institutional voids throughout the supply chain. Now, you're presenting in the paper that multinationals make use of institutional voids in order to do it the other way around, actually, to make use of these institutional voids, not to solve such institutional voids. And thus, by doing that, we are, in our case here, polluting the environment. So if multinationals work on decreasing the effects on the environment, where would be the opportunity for multinationals in emerging countries? This is my first question. My second question goes for the other party, which is the government. Most of emerging countries and developing countries, like Egypt, for example, they attract investments, unfortunately, in the most polluting industries. Like, for example, here in Egypt, we have cement as one of the most polluting industries and one of the most expanding as well, talking about plastic and so on. So if we are calling for countries in emerging countries to put laws and regulations, as you suggest, to mitigate the problem of corporate environmental externalities, wouldn't that also decrease the foreign direct investment in these countries?
Yes, I mean, I had a very nice quote here that I didn't didn't present, but this quote basically says that because I'm starting with the second question. So the quote basically says that in emerging markets often prioritize growth and investment, foreign direct investment over environmental protection. So there's especially even more in emerging markets than in developing countries, if you can separate that for a moment. There's often even more pollution than in developing countries, because there's so much emphasis on growth. And through the growth itself, there is so much more pollution than in other contexts, because growth is so rapid. And even if institutions are being built up, they cannot keep pace with, let's say, the rapid growth. So that's one part of the problem. Coming to cement industry, well, in cement industry, especially in Egypt, I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but usually cement industry is not a good that gets exported much across borders, because it's very heavy and it's of low value. So Egypt is probably not going to be the center of cement production of the world. So that cement production that you do see in Egypt is very much dedicated to the Egyptian market, and that again relates to growth activity in Egypt, building activity, population growth, and so on and so forth. So these are certain issues that have probably also other reasons than those that I mentioned here. So that's maybe as a reply to your second question. Of course, the pollution haven theory still holds. Also, I'm not saying it's not relevant. I'm just saying what we often overlook when we look at pollution haven is that there are normal activities of businesses, and these are as polluting, and they're more polluting. And so when Carrefour comes to Egypt, that don't deliberately pollute here, but they tend to be more polluting than they are in France, let's say. And I try to explain why this is the case. Coming back to your first question, I don't think that we have here in this paper a different take on institutions as you suggested. I think all papers on institutional voids basically argue that you can deal with institutional voids in different ways. So either you adapt to the void environment, or the void environment gets adapted to the firm. So you have basically these two directions of adaptation. So either you just cope or circumvent, or either you adapt basically, or you change the environment that doesn't fit to you. And the thing that is different here, I don't think they exploit the voids. Maybe you have to explain a little more. I just think they have to, the voids, they do something with their business systems that means that they pollute more. But I wouldn't say this is a way of exploiting. It's rather having an effect on their business activities. And that's why we call for to cover these voids, or to deal with these voids. And you can deal with these voids in 4 different ways, ignoring them, circumventing them, coping with them, or compensating them. So I do not see this as a completely different logic than in the other context, where usually, of course, the voids are absent markets. And in this context, it's not absent markets, the voids, but absent, absent legislation, and more importantly, absent reinforcement of this legislation.
Yeah, what I mean is multinationals try to make use of this absence in order to make more profits and decrease costs in developing countries. This is what I mean.
Okay, well, this would mean that Carrefour comes deliberately to Egypt in order to exploit the void of, let's say, bad garbage collection. And I don't think that they do that deliberately. They don't come to Egypt to exploit poor garbage collection. It's rather because there's poor garbage collection, their business model has more negative effects. But I don't think they come because, I mean, this pollution haven, yes, they're in this case, but then you deliberately come because there's poor legislation. But I don't think that was the motivation for car manufacturers, for supermarkets to come to Egypt, because there are voids. They happen to be there, they have negative effects, but that they are not the original reasons why these firms come to these markets.
Yeah. So we open the floor for other questions by the end of the panel. Now we move to the presentation of Professor Julia. Thank you very much, Professor Julia. We turn back to you with questions from the floor after the presentation.
So thank you and good afternoon. You should be able to see my screen, I hope, and you should be able to hear me. So thank you very much for the invitation to give a short presentation today on the role of MNCs in sustainable supply chain management and implications for suppliers. I'll put my watch right next to me so that I can try to stick to the time. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sorry I couldn't make it yesterday, but it was a day with too much homeschooling and too much home kindergarten and too much of not getting done anything. So my apologies, because the program looked really promising. But let's look at today, and I just realized that maybe I need to talk to Mr. Florian on how to frame SSCM, so Sustainable Supply Chain Management, to see if that's a way of addressing or avoiding institutional voids. And because this presentation also is a bit about risk mitigation and about lacking enforcement of standards in countries and why there actually is a thing as sustainable supply chain management. So let's talk today a little bit about so what is sustainable supply chain management or supply chain management, and the specific role of the focal company? This would be like a Carrefour, as Mr. Becker-Rittersbach just said. And why should companies worry about sustainability in supply chains? And what do you do if you practice sustainable supply chain management, and what implications for suppliers, but also for research and etc. could there be? Well, we are living in a globalized economy. Our goods come from all over the country and all over the world. They are shipped back and forth until they reach our shelves and until we buy them. And they have a long story depending on the product. You have so many sub-tier levels that it's hard to understand where do the components of all that go into the product actually comes from. Think about your laptops, your smartphones, cars. It's utterly complex. However, in supply chain management, and if you studied business, you've heard that before, you manage the flow of material and information um, between the companies in a supply chain, and you also manage the cooperation between companies in that chain, and even sometimes you cooperate on product development. So supply chain is a central business function. And when you think about it, for example, the textile industry, you go from the left, fiber production, to the right, to the trading. You have the flow of material, which goes from left to right, but you have the flow of information, which goes in both ways, because, in the fabric production, you may tell the fabric, in the fabric production, the weaving, you may tell the fiber production that the fiber wasn't so good, and you may tell the apparel manufacturing when stuff gets delivered. So you have a cross function with different levels of communication in between, which in itself already makes supply chain management a bit of a complex issue. Well, and that, so on supply chains depends the final cost of the product, customer benefits, customer satisfaction, also the productivity of your companies, and your revenues. If you have a lot of issues in your supply chain, if your suppliers are unreliable, this could lead to insecurities in your flow of material, and therefore also to a couple of risks. What is important when we look at sustainable supply chain management in a minute is we have a network structure. So we generally don't have any more this from left to right, one single company in each step, but you have multiple actors in a supply chain. You have more than one supplier supplying you with the raw materials or with the fabrics or with the printing. And then you have further up, you have different levels of customers. And what is important, what we're focusing on here is this little black box in the middle, the so-called focal company, which manages the entire process in both directions. So you could think about this could be, the focal company could be an Apple, a Samsung, a Huawei, but also a cement factory. Well, that could also be the focal company in the middle. Well, why should companies and MNCs in particular actually worry about sustainability in their supply chains, beside the institutional voids and inefficiencies Mr. Becker-Rittersbach just pointed out? There's a couple plain risks that you should be, or that companies should be aware of. These are some prominent risks or disasters and tragedies that you may have heard of. To the far left is a picture from a dam that broke in Brazil, which led to a devastation of the entire river basin and devastated the livelihoods of many, many fisheries and farmers along there, because it was polluted water that spread all around that area, and the soil and the water, what got contaminated. The middle one, you probably all have heard of it, the Rana Plaza breakdown of that factory of garment manufacturers in Bangladesh, which killed more than 1,000 workers at that point in time. And to the right, you see children working in India in this case, and they are picking mica, which is the shiny glimmer that goes into your, among other things, decorative cosmetics. So we have different issues in supply chains in different countries and in nearly all the supply chains. I mean, there's hardly any product where we cannot detect any issue along the value chain. And there's many more to come. There's many different products, many different supply chains. Different countries have different issues, you know, cocoa, coffee, bananas, cotton, you name it. There's a couple of issues. And the thing is that when you look from this black box in the middle, this focal company, and let's say we are a car manufacturer here on the left, so we are that focal company, we do know with whom we have the contracts on the first level. So we know where the steering wheel comes from, we know where we buy the paint, we know where we buy the car, the tire, we know where we buy the navigation system. But there's so many sub-tiers that we may not know of, because our first tier will not tell us deliberately who is the second tier, and the second tier will not tell the first tier, and certainly not the OEM, who's the third tier. Where are these suppliers located? What, you know, and under what conditions are they producing? So the transparency increases from left to right, but at the same time, in general, the risks increase also from left to right. So we should worry about what's going on the tier 3 level, also because consumers and increasingly so legislators are interested in, well, what is going on and how do you take responsibility for that? We should focus on that for some business perspectives as well. We have procurement risks. You may have heard of that before, that you know, we're interested in getting the required components in the right time and the right quality, but sometimes issues happen in the supply chain which are linked to sustainability issues. For example, a fire or accidents, which then break your supply chain and you wonder why, and it could be linked to sustainability. Sales risks, you know, consumers demanding to know where the stuff comes from, how the stuff was made. Financial markets who are saying that we want to know how you're doing your sustainable supply chain management if we are investing in you, and also a lot of reputational risks from end consumers, from media, NGO attention, etc. So if you consider all of these risks, and at the same time also the opportunities involved, engage in sustainable supply chain management, and generally have these this framework, you know, transparency and commitment are the two, yeah, sounding or pillaring or surrounding elements, and then you have elements of evaluation, control, and development, and they relate to your interaction with your respective suppliers. And I will go through them one-on-one very quick though. So bear with me, but I will give you the full deck of slides so that you can look at the more detailed slides. So when we skip through them a little bit. So first of all, you need to commit your supplier. You need to tell your supplier what is actually what you're expecting of them, especially for the reasons Mr. Becker-Rittersbach also just said. There is institutional void. Some suppliers in some countries just don't know what you're talking about or what companies in general from a Western industrialist perspective are talking about when they say environmental management. So one needs to explain this to the suppliers, and it should be ideally part of the contract so that when there is a violation, there should be an option for action. And there is a couple international recognized standards one could reference to. And here's an example of the automotive industry. Then when you have a supplier on board, or even when you're considering taking a supplier on board, you could ask them for self-assessment. What is your performance? Do you have somebody responsible for environment? Do you have a compliance system in place? Does the supplier actually know what compliance is? Have they ever talked about human rights? Have they ever talked about discrimination, about gender equality, about how they're dealing with policies or political institutions? So one should screen for these issues in the supply chain to see what issues could there be, are there risk categories, and then go forward following a risk management approach, especially for large MNCs, which have a huge number of suppliers. And what we did is, in a paper that we published last year, is we looked at a huge car manufacturer who had in place a self-assessment questionnaire, actually two versions of it, an old one and a new one, and tried to find out the difference between the two of them, and also the performance of the suppliers in the different countries. And we found out that there's a certain ranking of the suppliers, how much and what the average score is, but the average score was a bit of a surprise to see where and how it differentiated. And we will now, in a second paper, evaluate what could be the reasons. So is there adaptation towards those questions? Do suppliers, foresee what kind of questions or what kind of answers are expected? And then if we have that tendency, how can you check for truth in those self-assessments, or is it going to be time to throw these self-assessments away, which have been a highly pushed element in sustainable supply chain management? When you are having a supplier, it's critical also to control a supplier. We've seen audits, and Mr. Becker-Rittersbach mentioned the ISO 14001 environmental management certification. A lot of multinational companies are expecting their suppliers to show their environmental management through certificates. There, of course, on the other side is fraught with certificates. So what can you trust? And what are complaints mechanisms? So how would you find out as a Coca-Cola or as a Carrefour that something is going on at your, I don't know, cucumber supplier in Egypt to the local Carrefour network? How would Carrefour get to know about this? And then what actions could they do? And audits have been set to be one standard tool of it. There's also a bit of critique on audits, especially from non-governmental organizations and from rights holders organizations. This thing that once the auditor shows up, everything is fine. But I will show you that there's ways to find out that still not everything may be fine, or there may be a shiny glimmer in everything. And this is, I know it's small, but I will show it a bit bigger in the next slide. This is the increase of the number of audits performed by so-called sector initiatives. So Fairware Association, Aluminum Stewardship Initiative, Responsible Business Alliance, Amafori, BSCI, and you can see from left to right the number of audits they performed from 2010 to 2019, and you can see a high number of increases. Still, compared to the number of suppliers which are in those supply chains, that's still comparably small, but the trend is crystal clear. And there's certainly currently no other option of how to check for compliance other than sending an audit. Well, the thing, when we talk to businesses, what we're telling them is that the real work starts when the audit is done, because then you get the report and you probably see a lot of issues that need to be dealt with. So the corrective action plan needs to be developed. And also you may want to invest in trainings or capacity building of suppliers. There's networks where companies jointly want to do that. For example, in the Maghreb region, actually, or in China or in India. So companies have realized that they have to bring the tools and the knowledge to those countries and enable the businesses to stay in the globalized supply chains, because it's a give and take. You need those businesses in your supply chain, yet at the same time you cannot afford anymore that they are so polluting or so poorly treating their workforce. This is an example of Bosch, for example, where they have an online training for their suppliers. And then we have the overarching issue of transparency. There is now the demand of knowing where your stuff comes from, ideally entirely from final product to all the raw materials, which makes it especially difficult for electronics, for example, where you have up to 16 tiers, 16 levels of supply chain in your smartphone or in your computer, and also knowing not only where it comes from, but how stuff was produced. But this is clearly a trend and a demanding and challenging issue for the future. And to show you how complex and how needed this aspect is, I want to show you 2 slides from, and I will show them in a bit more detail in a minute, but you can see on the right already that the upper picture is less complex than the lower picture. And what we did is we went to a focal company and one of their strategic tier 1 suppliers. And we asked the tier 1 together with that company, well, how does your supply chain look like? And the tier 1 told us, well, this is what it looks like. So we have from focal company to the mine, we have 6 levels of suppliers. This is what they thought, what it looked like. And we did a specific approach on auditing and on demanding information. And at the end of the project, the supply chain looked like this. So the question is, did the tier 1 lie, or did they not know what they were talking about? And probably the answer is somewhere in the middle. And to make things worse is we don't know how quickly they changed the actors in the middle. So how quickly does the the tier 4 exchange someone in the tier 5 because maybe they couldn't deliver the quantities that they wanted? So this shows you how utterly complex this demand for transparency in the supply chain of all products actually is. To us, this was a fascinating project, and for the company, it was quite a challenge, but this shows you where the issues are on transparency and traceability, especially in complex supply chains. What are implications for suppliers and maybe also for research? Well, certainly we have an increasing need to develop and implement SCCM activities at the level of suppliers, and that is also at the level of companies, for example, in Egypt who want to be part of supply chains that supply to MNCs. And I think here's also a clear link for universities in those countries to make a link, to explain the need and to make linkages to the concepts that are out there. There's an increasing need to actually actively demonstrate the ESG performance, so environmental, social, and governance, not only report, but show in the numbers. How much do you pay? What is the wage increase? What is your CO2 consumption? How did it reduce? How did it increase? And there's also an increasing need for those companies within the supply chain to do something with their supply chain further down, which has implications for countries, for institutions in the countries, etc., as the demand from focal companies to address SCCM activities clearly is increasing. And also by regulation, not only that we finally have the draft of a German law, which should come into effect not only, Florian, until 2023, for companies with more than 1,000 people, but we have an initiative at the EU level. We have the UK Modern Slavery Act. We have the California and the Supply Chain Transparency Act. We have the French Law de Vigilance. So there's enough reason to get active on this issue. And the companies affected by that legislation are passing that down to their suppliers. And you can find that fair or not, but that is actually what's happening. And for suppliers, it's also, it's about building trust with your customers. It's about control, transparency, traceability, compliance, and also about, security of supply, quality, and partnerships. So when you integrate or when you pursue sustainable supply chain management, you usually also get some business implications and some monetary rewards out of it. But this is yet under or not explored by the research community. So this is another interesting piece of research where it's slowly getting there to see what is the economic benefit of sustainable supply chain management, but currently there is no answer to that. So thank you for your attention, and sorry for rushing you through this.
Thank you very much, Professor Julia, for the interesting presentation. I would like to note something regarding compliance. So remember, this project was working on with ILO, as you stated, as one of the international organizations working on labor compliance. And we found out that there is this factory in the center of Ramadan, which is one of the known textile clusters in Egypt. This factory was not complying to the minimum H level for employment, which is not abiding with the abolishing of child labor. And actually this halted the process of exporting to H&M in Turkey, because the main company there required that they should abide to the one of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is complying to labor standards and labor aid. Another example when it comes to agriculture needs here in Egypt, because we're exporting a lot of agricultural products to Europe, now we have actually coding for tier 1 and 2, at least tier 1 and 2 suppliers, those who are exporting to Germany and other European countries through local conglomerates here in Egypt. So what I'm trying to say is maybe an interesting focus is the role of internationalization, be it exporting or other strategies, in promoting compliance or sustainable supply chains in developing or emerging countries.
Well, it is certainly about compliance, but I think we also had the discussion beyond compliance. So compliance is expected, but then the question is, on how can you ensure compliance at all times? And that's, I think, that's still very challenging. And on the issue of child labor, that is, I think, the nightmare of everyone's CSR supply chain manager, and to find out an issue of child labor in your supply chain. It's a nightmare. And the thing is, you will have to work with local NGOs, with local rights holders organizations to solve the issue. But what is agreed upon, and this is a hard message, should not do first, is to cut the chain. Because if you have child labor in your supply chain, and if you cut the chain immediately without warning, you will make the situation of the children not better, but worse, because they're living the family loses the income. The children will go into even worse working conditions to cope with the lost income. So trying to find a solution out of child labor in your supply chain is extremely difficult. It is not easy. And the thing is, there is no one-fits-all approach. This is something that has to be evaluated carefully, and it has to be dealt with, and it has to be abolished. And you have to check on it, but that's a very hard case. And that's something, you don't wish for that to happen if you work in a company, to find that in your supply chain. Yet you must be aware of the risks. And it depends on the countries, and it depends on the sectors. For example, in cocoa and in coffee picking, you can hardly ever avoid it. So what are your precautions? What are your steps that you're taking? And it's not easy.
Schooling, for example. Yeah,
what?
In Egypt, they introduced night schooling for children participating in agriculture activities in the morning.
Yeah, or you pay an additional fee that they can go to school, or you hire the older sibling, which is who's eligible to work. Yeah. But it's extremely difficult, and to solve such a situation, you need to talk with the legislation. You need to engage rights holders, organizations, for sure. And in that case, I think it almost always costs you money, but it's worth it because the reputational damage is so devastating.
Yeah. So thank you, Professor Julia. So now we open the questions for Professor Florian and Professor Julia. And I see Professor Florian raising his hand, but actually Professor Noha will start because she asked first. And then we go for Professor Florian and other questions from the floor.
Okay, thank you very much to the panelists. Both presentations are very insightful. My question to both presenters, Professor Florian and Professor Julia, is basically there are too many negative externalities because of lack of corporate environmental responsibility. And these have resulted occasionally in disasters like the Rana Plaza, or issues of child labor that we're just talking about. And I think Dr. Julia also mentioned that we need two issues of transparency and commitment to be cross-cutting across the sustainable supply chain. My question is, therefore, should compliance with environmental regulations be mandatory on companies operating in emerging economies, or should it be left voluntary? For public-private partnerships, initiatives by the companies engaging in their own on their own free will. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I haven't made up my mind about this question. I've been thinking about it, and there are of course endless debates. But I'm hoping to get your views about this issue. Thank you.
Julia, I think it's more a question for you.
Okay, so thank you for the question. So first of all, I think one has to distinguish between there are local laws, that is clear, and they need to be followed. However, what Florian says is that, there is a lack of enforcement. There's an enforcement deficit on local laws, and one should not take advantage of that. If there is a local law, you have to comply with it, point. So compliance with local laws is essential. Now, the difficult things comes in when, for an MNC, which is located in a different country, the rules and regulations in that country are different than the local law. And I think for most of the MNCs, at least the technological ones, if they have their own factory operating somewhere, they clearly adhere to the highest standard. The thing is, how do they control for that at the suppliers? And that's a difficult one, because for suppliers, you can only force them to comply with local law. And you also have a tricky situation. For example, when you find out through an audit that your supplier doesn't comply with local law, what do? Do you call law enforcement, or do you not call law enforcement? Because when you call law enforcement, the supplier could be stopped tomorrow. So, or do you get him to comply with it, and do you help and build the capacity? So that's, I think compliance with local law is not a question that we need to ask anymore. The question that we need to ask is, how can we ensure compliance, even in situations where the law is not enforced? To give you an example, when you read the Chinese labor law, it reads like the German one, with overtime, premiums, limits of maximum hours that you can work, but nobody ever cares. So, law enforcement, although it's not maybe happening, as you want to make your suppliers enforce that law and respect it. And the question is, how do you get them to do so?
Thank you.
Okay, so Professor Florian had a question.
Yes, Julia, I find it very interesting what you're presenting, and something that haunts me as an idea or as a question is the issue of commitment. So even before these severe legislations across countries, many firms were at least superficially committed to certain environmental standards, human labor standards, human rights standards, and so on and so forth. But do you think that all these certification processes, all these certificates, even the ISO standards, that these were just more window dressing to get a sign of approval from some authority, but in the end of the day, they don't really care? Which brings me to the next question. Is that the reason why we need something like this current Lieferketten-Gesetz, or in English, the supply chain law that, I mean, you mentioned other countries, but this is something I've been reading about recently, so I'm more familiar with this. So do we need this at the end of the day for firms to really be committed, or are we having firms already so committed that this is actually superfluous?
So to maybe step back a bit, this German supply chain law is based on the United Nations Guiding Principles on Businesses and Human Rights. Basically, every country came up with a national action plan. Germany came up with a national action plan and found out that not nearly half the German businesses are having enough procedures in place to follow human rights due diligence. The human rights due diligence is not addressed by any of the certificates we currently have. We have the OECD guiding principles for multinationals on what they should do in their supply chain, but we see that not enough businesses are doing that, and certainly not in Germany. There is a bunch of businesses, especially smaller ones, who are still acting internationally and having subsidiaries internationally and having international supply chains who, frankly speaking, just don't care. Interestingly speaking, though, the ones who demanded and also actively called for such a law were the big corporations who had been active in the past. Mars Corporation, Nestle, Aldi, Volkswagen, Daimler, BMW, who said that only with the law we are creating a level playing field and we are not paying the upfront investment and everybody will follow on our wave because we have so many suppliers, so we're covering quite a substantial basis for it. So basically we're doing the work for everyone else. So I think that's a bit the thing. And the certification issue is a mess. There's a certificate for everything. Some certificates you can trust, others you can not trust. And the certification doesn't help you with the supply chain, or only in bits and pieces. So you could have a factory that has an ISO 14001, which is the environmental management certificate, but has no certification or nothing on workers' health and safety. So you would still have to worry about workers' health and safety, which is ISO 45001, by the way. And those management schemes only help you, but they don't set targets. So if you have a management system, that doesn't mean you have a carbon reduction target. But we want to see less CO2 emissions, less greenhouse gas emissions. So we also need the targets, we also need the measurements, and the measurements you don't see in the certificates, the numbers you don't see in the certificates, the goals you don't see in the certificates and the KPIs. So I think, yes, we have a lot of certification. Some certification helps, other certification doesn't help. Some certification is governed by multi-stakeholder initiatives. Some certifications are just company-driven, which can be debated whether they really help. So it's a complex issue.
So, Dr. Hadir, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Professor Florian and Professor Julia, for the very interesting presentations. I just have one question for Professor Florian. Do you think that consumers would have positive perceptions about the strategies companies undertake to fill the voids rather than focusing on the proactive actions that companies take, for example, in their production processes or, for example, in their supply chain? I mean, under what conditions do you assume that consumers would hold positive perceptions for companies' actions to fill the institutional voids?
All right, that's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that, but I will try to give the best possible answer on what my current thoughts are on this. So one of my argument was that I think firms cannot ignore these voids anymore, because this will have reputational effects. So in the worst case scenario, it will have reputational damage. So if you ignore these voids and you just, you know, go do business as usual and you pollute, that might trickle down to increasingly globally aware consumers in let's say developed and Western countries, but also possibly in the local environment. So that's the reputational side. And I think you can put this argument also upside down and say, okay, maybe if you proactively seek to fill these or to cope or circumvent these voids, and you have a positive impact and you neutralize your effect on the environment, you can use that as a unique selling point, let's say, of your business in a certain environment. Now, having said that, I think it's also interesting. I tend to present this concept in Egypt and in Germany, and I regularly ask my students in Egypt and in Germany if they think that CSR or CER in this particular case would, if respecting those standards and filling voids, if that would have a positive impact on corporate perception and possibly also give the firm a business case. And what I have seen so far is that Egyptian students usually said, that might be true for a certain elite of people in a country in Egypt, but for the average consumer, this will probably not have an effect. And that's slightly different, I guess, in Germany, where you see that even in supermarkets like Lidl and Aldi, which is the, you know, the lower range, where there even consumers who are probably not so well educated, if I may put it that way, or not being part of the economic elite, that they still increasingly care about such issues. So I would say that there's two answers. There's of course the negative and the positive side, how it impacts consumers, and then there's of course country differences.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ron, you have a question?
Hello. Actually, my question is a little bit simple. I'm basically getting back to square zero again. This is for also Professor Florian and for Professor Julia. Could there be a business model that is actually targeting to trying to fill such an institutional voids, like maybe business services companies that are trying to internationalize or expand in different markets where they are having a huge institutional void, like facilitation of resources, or maybe auditing supply chains, or providing solutions for attaining a sustainable supply chain strategy, or operationalizing some sustainable supply chain management strategies. Could this be then a company or a case of an MNC that is having a positive externality instead of having a negative one?
Well, I don't know if I've completely understood your question, but I think the original concept of void was to say, if there's some non-functioning market, that can also be a business opportunity, because you could be the linchpin to bring, for instance, together certain buyers and consumers, sellers and consumers. So I would also say, look at the plant in Mexico. Maybe this recycling plant operates profitably. I don't know. So you could use such a void to carve out a business opportunity. Let's say if you see more and more multinationals, to refer to Julia's argument, more and more multinationals are seeking compliance. You could be an Egyptian or an Indian or a Chinese local entrepreneur or an NGO that says, okay, we make this as a business model. We help multinational enterprises to trace the tiers and to hunt down breaches. And so that, I don't know, why not? I mean, you could make probably a business case of that. So that's how I understand your question, how I would answer it. But maybe.
I think on Florian's first answer, I just had to talk with a big company in a different setting, who were, pursuing their own standards, which they took from Northern Europe, and they tried to put it in a developing country. And it's a waste example. They sorted all the waste according to the European standards, and then ended up, realizing that nobody will take that waste in that country where they are, because the systems are not developed to take such separated waste. So they are now, developing actually the waste industry in that country, which is a business model change in addition to their business model. And on the service providers with the sustainable supply chain management, there is plenty already on the market who are trying to help companies within supply chains to cope with the expectations of their customers. What they are yet, to my understanding, not addressing is or not to a great extent, how could that improve the business locally in that business environment? Because this is not what they're specialized in. No? They are specializing in that your company can stay in business with that customer, fulfilling those demands, but they are not worrying that much about what could they do help you develop your business activities. That could be an option, but the market for fulfilling SSCM requirements is pretty intense. It's set to be 2.7 billion euros by 2023, according to a Deloitte study. We'll see, and it's in a consolidating phase right now. But I would completely agree that the Maghreb region and everybody in Africa, the market is completely underdeveloped, because we do, from a Western industrialized perspective, understand way too little of what are the needs, what is the translational issue of getting the commitment across. What are the expectations? How do you explain to that? So maybe there is a business opportunity, but I think it would be more in the explaining and the developing and then the consultancy, and not so much in the tools, because the market and the tools is really competitive. I mean, really competitive.
Thank you very much.
Okay, one final question from Robert.
Thank you so much for presentations. Very insightful. I just have one question. Professor Julia, you mentioned something about the role of universities in passing down information or requirements of sustainable supply chain to local suppliers. From your experience, how challenging this could be in emerging markets?
Challenging. Challenging for many reasons. So the one is exactly this execution deficit. They are getting by the laws, they will not get, and they know that in order to do the law, they have to. So that's us. And that's one of the institutional voids that we see and where companies go in. And you mentioned the cement industry. If you want to look at something or start something, I probably recommend don't start with cement, for several reasons. But explaining the concepts that they are out there, and the tools and how they interlink with the business case, I think that is a very, especially in a context of an applied university, that's that's a translation service, so to say, that the universities really can bring to businesses. And at the same time, by doing so, you have the opportunity to develop cases and to actually develop theory, because a lot of the theories that we have in sustainable supply chain management have actually not been tested in an emerging market context. So testing that theory, and there's an abundance of literature on sustainable supply chain management, and applying that in a developing country and testing it, I think that would be quite beneficial and could be a contribution to be made.
Okay, but again, the problem is then the mentality of the local suppliers, and how, is it enough to be just translated to them, how, or just the requirements of the sustainable supply chain, or there's an extra mile that we should go for in such countries in order to change the mentality?
The question is, is it only the mentality, or is it the not understanding? And I think it's sometimes not I think it's not only the mentality, it's also the not understanding what the requirements actually are and what are the processes to address these. Because often when you call us, let's say a smaller company, let's say 500 people, and the customer calls in and says, you have to do sustainable supply chain management. And the first reaction is panic and refusal, because they know too little about what is expected, what are the processes, what is involved, how much money does it cost me, how many people do I need, and they don't know the standardized tools that are out there. So I think it's both, no? But I don't think it's so much about mentality, because it's so interlinked with their business, but they often just don't see that. Because
Okay.
if you don't deliver, no longer the supplier of that company.